Hello everyone and welcome to the first episode of Game Dev React. First episode of something that will hopefully become a series on this channel. My name is Rafał.
I'm Julia.
And in this series we will be reacting to some of those interesting mechanics, maybe some failures or just interesting games that recently came out. Me and Julia are working as professional game designers for quite some time already.
And hopefully our experience will ignite some interesting design conversations and brainstorms while we will be playing.
Today we'll be playing Black Myth: Wukong. Black Myth: Wukong, a game that recently came out and a game that we were actually interested in playing for quite some time because it introduces some interesting mechanics, especially from the gameplay perspective, right?
Exactly.
So let's dive in. I like how the company is called Game Science. It's like opening a new restaurant and calling it gastronomy or the food science.
Yeah, but to be fair, if there is a company that deserves to be called that way, I think it's the creators of, what's your favorite game, Witchfire, right? They were creating it for how long at that point?
I think 42 years.
So if there is game science, they probably learned it from scratch.
They should teach it.
They probably created it. The soul of this project has arrived.
And
to
showing
show his butt.
Yeah, this is his better angle.
Damn, I love the design of those titans.
Ooh. I like how this part actually... You know this Unreal Engine 5 trailer? Can you say trailer for an engine? But yeah, they had this girl diving in and those flying by those trees and stuff. It seemed similar. Or I really want to see all of those enemies, but actually with AI controllers on them, and see the performance on it with Unreal Engine.
I can imagine this system with, seconds per frame, not frames per second.
All I ever wanted was a life in my mountain.
Oh yeah, I really love how they approach the voiceovers, especially in English. First of all, he actually mimics the Chinese way of speaking, but at the same time it's very theatrical, almost as if you are watching a play at the theater.
To be honest, I haven't thought about it in that way, but now that you mention it, yeah.
You bastards killing my kind!
Bastards killing my kind.
I don't know, I would already die for that character.
They really love the scale of it all. There was this game called Asura's Wrath, and the scale of the whole thing happening, there was this enemy literally the size of a planet. Seems similar to a degree, like the scale of enemies, the scale of those titans.
Technically, PS3 was actually my first ever console.
Oh,
that
really?
I played, yes.
He's not just any monkey.
What does he have on his forehead?
Hopefully a third eye.
It's a third eye. Well, it looks better than the one in Doctor Strange.
I knew exactly what you were gonna reference before you even voiced it.
Yeah, I prefer this one.
And actually, I'm curious, what will happen if you start running straight into those?
Immediately there is an invisible wall here.
Not my favorite solution to every problem, but...
Right, so the combat immediately feels very fluid.
It does look very, very agile.
Yeah.
Our favorite term,
Agile.
isn't it?
Yes. Oh, so that's interesting. So you actually perform a heavy attack on the release of the button, not on the press. That's a bold decision in terms of combat.
Yeah, for sure. Did you just summon literally mini-use?
Yeah.
I love it.
Apes,
Oh my god.
Fight him.
Apes together, strong.
Yes.
For that word, all realms and beings have ruined themselves.
Leon Kennedy moment.
Dodging is interesting because it leaves my silhouette, but it doesn't make him interested in that silhouette. So it's a little bit off. It feels a little bit weird because I don't know why the game would leave the silhouette there. It doesn't really make him interested in it.
Yeah, like for example in V Rising, which had a very similar mechanic, it would leave a silhouette behind to attract enemies towards that silhouette to attack it instead of you. I hope he will also pull out a small minigun like Ishin. I already love and hate this freezing mechanic.
Yeah.
On one hand, it just automatically kind of creates this assumption that you're just way more powerful than any boss, because you can just freeze them in one spot.
Yes, but the clouds. So what are we standing on? Is it like a cloud and we're fighting on a cloud, or is it a teenage vapor room?
Teenage. How old are you, remind me? But it still feels like right level of interactive. It's not just, a cinematic scene that just keeps going on.
Yeah. I also really like when they reuse actual gameplay mechanics in the cinematic. So it's actually not that common that games do it in this consistent way, and I think it actually adds to the immersion. Because I understand why he did it.
Yeah, fair enough. Actually, the only games that were consistently doing exactly that were basically Souls games. Dark Souls, Elden Ring, they were consistently not letting you down with cinematic. For example, entries for bosses, where you would literally see the actual abilities that will annihilate you literally 3 seconds afterwards in this cinematic intro, and you always knew what to expect, and you were rarely disappointed by it.
It does feel very anime, but in very graceful way. Some games go a little bit too far with it. This one is on the
it's
perfect
hitting the spot.
Yeah,
it's hitting the spot of that.
The last tale of Sun Wukong. A hero.
So it's all in-engine, which is quite impressive. Not only the first part where they literally split the mountain in half, but now all those trees are growing out. It seems like all in-engine content, so they had to actually render it without using a third-party software, which is quite impressive in my opinion.
Yeah, I agree.
Only fueled their mistrust.
Behold, an egg.
An egg. It's the one from Elden Ring DLC. I love the telegraphing of the attacks. Like, he actually did this whole wind up before hitting. Oh yes, invisible walls.
Honestly, up to a degree, or maybe up to a high degree, I actually prefer when the landscape suggests if you jump there you will die, and then you can.
Yeah.
The player to actually jump there and die.
But this is interesting. Look, I see a wall, a physical wall. I do understand that I cannot go there, but it seems that there's an invisible wall even in front of it. Well, it definitely solves some issues for the game, because in my opinion, especially for the melee fighting game, first of all, you will not end up as a player in a spot where you cannot go back from, but also it will probably make sure that enemy will not end up somewhere there, so they cannot hit you, since they are also fighting with melee, and they probably cannot reach you through any ranged attack. So it's kinda solves two issues, but it does seem a little bit too artificial. It seems like I'm trapped in a cage, and I don't like it personally.
Hey, wait! I, the keeper of Black Wind Mountain, have
Super powerful character.
Yeah, the rules of anime tell us that he's the actual villain behind it all. The small guy you met at the very beginning.
Maybe. Or he'll be your Master Yoda. It's as if the smaller is the character, the higher is the concentration of power per each square centimeter.
Yes. So this is interesting because there is no minimap on the game, and usually games like that will tell me where to go using either hero assets or just landmarks to showcase, but it all seems the same level of flat, or rather there is no interesting landmark to go to. It all seems very much similar all around. Doesn't seem very understandable for me.
Yeah, I totally see what you mean. Also, it's lacking this element to it where in majority of games you can clearly see which path will lead you to some, secret, Narnia door, and which one is the main path you are supposed to follow. I don't really feel it from this game.
Stamina has an interesting design choices here in my opinion, because I was able to still attack him after my stamina was depleted. I was still able to dodge, but I think only once, and then the dodge cooldown kicked in. Usually I really prefer games where depleting stamina doesn't restrict your movement per se, We also unlock this mechanic of acquiring enemy ability to your item in the game, but here I have a really big issue with it. Input for it is pressing Alt L2 and R2, and the game doesn't seem to do a very good job at registering pressing those two buttons at the same time, and I always have to press it maybe 3-4 times, and that actually adds to my bigger issue about the input system in general, because, well, the game doesn't have the attack cancelling or dodge cancelling in the game, which is good to a certain degree, because this is how usually Souls-like approach it, at least those less dynamic ones, but at the same time, the game sells this idea of being very dynamic.
And very agile, yeah.
Yeah, and this creates this lack of correlation to what I'm seeing on the screen and what I feel in my hands. I feel like there is a little bit of lag or delay before the action happens, and on top of that, with actions that require very precise input for them, it just becomes a little bit messy, and I don't feel this connection between the controller and the game,
Yeah, I totally know what you mean. Essentially, on screen and narrative-wise, you see a very agile character who moves a lot, who does, a lot of unnecessary spins and combos and pirouettes all around. And then, as a player controlling this character, sometimes you kind of feel clumsy.
And speaking of combat readability, I noticed that some smaller enemies actually have quite readable hit reactions to them, but whenever you're fighting a bigger enemy, like in this case, there is no hit reaction. If you see, like right now, I'm hitting him, but the only way I know I'm hitting him is the sound effect and the visual effect, but there is no twitch reaction on the body whatsoever, and this creates this dissonance that I'm not very okay with. I'm only relying on the fact that I'm hitting the enemy on visual and sound effects and not the animation itself. Usually Souls-likes, or just generally From Software games, approach it in a way that no matter the scale of the enemy, there is some twitch reaction added on top of the animation of the enemy as an additive animation. But here, it seems that bigger enemies just don't have it, and you have to fully rely on those additional effects. So actually, since we are in the later part of the game, maybe let's talk about the progression.
So far, the power-up mechanics actually feel really cool and fitting, especially with my personal favorite spell of Immobilize, and you can immobilize any enemy regardless of how badass they are looking.
With this one I actually have one issue, because sometimes you can immobilize them mid-air and they are so high above you that you cannot reach them whatsoever. I would like some sort of fallback here, that if you perform it when they are 20 feet in the air, they actually land to a spot that you can hit them and only then become immobilized. Sometimes you need to push player into certain situations and kinda use some of those smoke and mirror mechanics to make them feel very smart, and this is not the case here.
Yeah, it's almost like your life choices have consequences. But coming back to the RPG systems themselves, you can clearly see there was a discovery phase for those. They were purposefully searching for what is fun and going for it in a pretty bold way, but that fits the game like 10 out of 10. At the same time, I feel like there are some elements of it that can be improved in my opinion. For example, leveling up system. Well, with this leveling up, the only thing you are receiving as a player is essentially 1 perk point to spend, as that's the entirety of level up system. So what I would actually really want to see on top of having a perk point is if you would also have a choice to invest into a certain stat. So for example, vitality stats, stamina, vigor, however they would want to call it. So I would have this additional mechanic on top of it, where I can also spec into specific stats that would diversify my gameplay and my build and make me feel like my choices matter.
In general, the usual enemies in the game are not hard whatsoever. They are just there for you to kill, but then you stumble across higher tier enemy and you get stuck on it. So in my opinion, it's a little bit too diverse in a way that most of the enemies in the games are extremely easy to fight, but then you have this spike in the difficulty, and the majority of the game doesn't require you to learn combat mechanics. Only those boss encounters actually require from you this actual knowledge of how to fight, and I'm not sure if it's a good direction here.
Yeah, I really get what you mean. For me, the game also, like, balance-wise, lacks this middle layer of difficulty. It's either extremely easy or really difficult.
There is one thing that I'm actually a little bit worried about, because it's a very corridor-ish game. Everywhere you can actually walk is quite limited, and there are corridors that you go through. And what's worrying about it is that, well, it's another Unreal Engine 5 game that kinda forcefully has this corridor-ish element to it, where the game would actually, in my opinion, benefit from being a little bit more open, or just more strictly corridor-ish. Well, this is something in between, and I personally don't really love the layout that doesn't yet fully go into the corridor-ish setup, but isn't an open world per se. Alright, so thank you very much for this episode of Game Dev React. Those were our impressions from playing the first 4 or so hours from Black Myth Wukong. And overall, I would say the game is definitely very interesting and has some very bold decisions, especially on their gameplay and combat mechanics, along with the animation direction and how they approach onboarding for the player and the difficulty curve on the enemies.
And from my side, I can definitely say that the art style of the game is literally freaking amazing. The theme of it, the style of it, the way you feel while you play the game. It definitely delivers on the power fantasy side, it definitely delivers on the fun side. They made a lot of, as you said, bold decisions that did, in my opinion, pay off, and created some very unique interactions and very unique elements to the game.
So let's go kill some foxes and some big babies with blue hats and some snake looking men, and see you in the next one.
Yeah, see you, bye.
Bye.